So the Cold War was a long time in effect. In fact, it really is starting all over again with Vladimir Putin, who is heading up Russia now. He's starting the Cold War all over again. So we're not out of that era. Churchill knew in advance that we were probably going to have to fight Russia, even though during World War II and near the end, we were supposed to be considering Russia as an ally. So a lot of information we kept giving Russia in addition to planes and tanks and trucks and that sort of thing, war material, because we thought that Russia was an ally. So when I say Russia, I really mean USSR, which, as I mentioned yesterday, is composed of the countries surrounding the country of Russia. You can imagine losing 25 million people in one war. So when Russia pushed out the Germans and got into Germany, they were really there to take revenge on the Germans, and they definitely did. They took revenge on the German soldiers as well as the German citizens. The German soldiers, by the thousands, would try to escape from the advancing Russians and go to the British or Americans to be captured or to be given up as prisoners of war. They did not want to be a prisoner of war of Russia. So the Allies decided that the city of Berlin, which was the main headquarters, just like Washington, D.C. for us, Berlin, even today, is the same idea. It's the center of government for the whole country. And so the Allies divided up the city of Berlin into 3 sectors. And if you ever ran across any information about the Berlin Wall, that Berlin Wall was erected by the Russians, and I suspect mainly to keep the Eastern Germans from escaping to the West, because life in East Germany at that time, or East Berlin, was extremely harsh. Hundreds and hundreds of people were shot trying to climb the wall out of East Berlin to get to West Berlin. So, as you can expect, we talked about this before, and that is that things were happening in the world of aviation, especially in commercial activity, and civil aviation in our country literally exploded. That's probably a good word for it, because the number of pilots and the number of aircraft beginning to fly around the United States at that moment in time was something that no one had ever seen before. People were just shocked when they looked up at the sky, because all of their lives they'd never seen much of anything, and all of a sudden now they see all these little and big aircraft buzzing around. It was really hard for them to take, because they couldn't understand what had happened in such a short period of time. So in international aviation, some organization needed to step forward and say, hey guys, we need to have some standards here. Just like one of the early computer companies, especially Microsoft, decided early on that they were going to try to establish some standards, right? Control-C, Control-V, Control-X, those are things that were established by the dominant computer company at the time and have carried through all the way into the Apple series and everything else. If it hadn't been for some of the early companies like Microsoft, the computer industry would be chaos. Anyway, the individual countries of the world knew that there were going to be some problems in aviation, and they started asking questions about how are we going to handle all of the complexity of every country trying to do its own thing. So there was a Chicago conference. Don't worry about this. You're not going to be questioned on it. You will be questioned on the fact that the Chicago conference had a lot to do with trying to establish standards in aviation, not only in the United States, but aviation worldwide. So think about the Chicago Conference as being one of the first major organizations and gatherings that helped to define how aviation was going to look for the next 40 or 50 years. And you can see by the articles, and you can also see tomorrow, if you're really interested, you can get on the website and you can look at this again in detail. But you're not going to be questioned on any of these individual annex or articles. I just want to show you that there were some early organizations doing some very, very critical thinking on how are we going to organize and standardize the world's aviation operations. All of these actions, take a quick look at some of these articles and you'll realize they're very logical, they're very sensitive, and they're very important too. You simply cannot carry on worldwide commercial aviation without an agreement on all of these points, somehow or other. Now, it didn't necessarily carry that all of these conferences, all these annexes and conferences were adopted, but they certainly had a lot to do with making sure that the organizations in Europe were going to be following through on it. You can see a lot of the things that we've already gotten involved in. Not licensing. You're talking about getting a drone license. Aeronautical charts, we've gone over that already. Units of measure, even that's important, because the English and the United States were working on the pound system, and the rest of Europe was working on the metric system. We should have changed to the metric system. It's far easier, and there are many, many more countries around the world that are using the metric system than are using the system that we in England are using. But you can see that Annex 6 takes into account international air. More annexes. Pardon? I don't want you to write details. I'll go back. I want you to get a sense of how comprehensive were the organizations that were trying to come up with standards for the world's aviation. Not the least, of course, of which is the Meteorological Service for International Air Navigation. And then countries like England and other countries would spend money to develop radio navigation stations in Iceland and Greenland so that aircraft coming across the Atlantic Ocean would have better means of navigation than they did at the time. So you can see all of the factors, the information that had been developed and was being developed, including airworthiness of aircraft. Airworthiness of aircraft was an important factor because if you brought a British aircraft over to the United States and you expected citizens of the United States to get on board that aircraft, there has to be some reason why those citizens, the public, should rely on the fact that that aircraft was designed with safety in mind. So safety standards in the design of aircraft were established very early on. And anybody that was willing to sell aircraft had to meet those safety requirements. These are the really critical kinds of things that had to happen early in aviation history. Not the least of which frequencies around the world. Aeronautical radio frequency spectrum utilization. That is, we have a spectrum of frequencies. Who are we going to give them to? How are we going to segregate them? Well, you already know that VORs, right, go from 108 to 117.9. And then voice communication goes from 118.0 to 135.999. You already know that because we've covered that in class. But those are the kind of things that needed to be done by someone at the end of the war, at the end of World War II. And again, just take a look at some of the things that were being looked at that needed to be done. Okay, and we talked about the ICAO before, and that's the International Civil Aviation Organization, that today definitely has a lot to do with the standards that are set or with changes that might be made. For example, there's the VOR here in Fresno that's located just by Valley Children's Hospital. It's called the Clovis VOR. CZQ is the Morse code identifier. That VOR is going to go out. But before we take it out, we had to get the approval from the ICAO, because foreign aircraft coming to this United States and flying up and down California, or flying over California to San Francisco or Los Angeles or San Diego, often would have to use that VOR. So we can't just arbitrarily say we're going to get rid of the VOR in Clovis. It's not in Clovis. It's over by the Valley Children's Hospital across the river. But that's the kind of things that ICAO is responsible for. In addition, as it points out, they were the ones that actually arranged the joint financing. Well, the joint financing didn't come from the ICAO. It came from contributing countries, and there were not a lot of contributing countries at the time, not as many as there are today. There's another organization called the International Air Traffic Association, and as it shows there, it was set up to help establish some control over fares and also lobbying the various governments of the world. There was always trouble with Russia trying to overfly Russian airspace. That was a no-brainer. That was a difficult situation because in many ways the shortest routes for many people in Europe were up over Russia to get to this side of our world. Civil Aeronautics Administration was the forerunner of the FAA, so the CAA morphed into the FAA when it became apparent that we needed something much more significant in the federal government than just a tiny little agency off to the side somewhere, which was what the CAA was initially. So one of the things that they did, of course, they set up things like the phonetic alphabet. It became apparent during World War II with fighters and gunners and people on the ground, the forward observers radioing back. The situation was very, very critical because, for example, a forward observer for a howitzer, for a gun on the ground, firing over into the front lines of the Germans, if there was a garble in the transmission and the frontline observer would say, repeat, repeat. Well, the guy manning the gun figured that was to repeat the shelling in the same way. And of course it wasn't. He didn't want them to do that. So there were people killed as a result of just the fact that there was miscommunication between the forward observer and the gunners. They got rid of that by saying, say again. Never, ever would they ever use the word repeat again. But if you wanted someone to say something again to you in communication, you'd use the word say again. And that's really true even now. If you're going to learn to be a pilot and you're going to fly around the United States and you misunderstood the air traffic controller, don't say repeat. Just say again. So look at all the things that have happened that began to develop, not the least of which is the landing systems. PAR is Precision Approach Radar, ILS is Instrument Landing System, GCA is Ground Controlled Approach. The GCA and the PAR primarily are used today by the military, but if I want to take my airplane out and I want to experience what it's like to go through a PAR or a GCA, then I would call the Moore Naval Air Station and I would ask them to give me one of those approaches. It's interesting because you're flying around and you're doing most of the flying, and then all of a sudden you turn your responsibility over to a guy on the ground who sits there and says, do not answer anything I say, just follow the instructions. And he'll say, turn left 5 degrees, descend and maintain 2,000 feet. He'll keep talking you all the way down, and you have to continue to do exactly as he or she says, and finally you break through the clouds and you're on the ground. those are interesting approaches. Commercial aviation in those days, especially after World War II and on into the beginnings of the 1960s, commercial aviation just boomed. And in the meantime, they needed more and better commercial airliners, and good old Boeing, as good as they are in marketing, they saw it coming, and before anyone else, except the British. Now, the British did develop a commercial jetliner, which had a tragic ending, but they did develop it. But Boeing came along and developed the Boeing 707, and therefore captured nearly 95% of the world's airline usage, because it was dependable, it was big, it could carry a lot of passengers, it was fast, wasn't terribly quiet, wasn't terribly efficient, but it was definitely an aircraft out there that the airlines could order, and did, by the dozens. So one of the things that was happening was the number of people flying around the United States were starting to get in one another's ways. Two commercial airliners collided in the air over the Grand Canyon because both airliners, one from the United States, one from the West Coast and one from the East Coast, decided they wanted to show their passengers what it looked like, what the Grand Canyon looked like from the air. And they couldn't just fly by, because that meant that only one side of the airplane, the passengers, could see it. So what they did was they both went over the middle of the canyon and started circling around so that passengers on both sides of the aircraft could see it, and they collided. There's wreckage still on one of the walls in the Grand Canyon. I've been down the Grand Canyon on a raft 3 times, and each time I go down, that same constellation, the pieces of that constellation are still up on the hillside, or on the cliffside, I should say. They collided in midair. They didn't collide on any of the cliffs, but the wreckage came down. They got most of the wreckage out, but apparently that what wreckage is still there was too dangerous to try to remove. Anyway, they started developing all kinds of methods, timing as well as radar. Radar began to be more and more used. You could see that a circle around Chicago kept getting a little larger and pretty soon it would reach the Mississippi River. So if I was going to fly, as I did, from Chicago to Denver, I would get past the Mississippi River, and I'd realize that I was no longer under radar contact. So I had to report where I was and what altitude I was, and I had to do that every 15 minutes. Okay, we're going to stop here at Airway Crisis, and we will continue this tomorrow. Let's take a 10-minute break. Be back here at 2:20.